Okay, you are live, Dr. Judy. Welcome.
Okay, thank you so much. And thank you, audience, for bearing with the tech support. And we are live, I believe. Yes?
We are.
Okay, so what the Freud is permeability because it can be your superpower. And it also may not be your superpower at times. So I'm going to dive right into this. And so let's talk about permeability and what I mean by that. If you have not already read my book, Be the Cause Healing Human Disconnect, please go ahead and download a free copy of it by requesting it, or you can order it off of Amazon.com. And in panel number 5, I'll get through the mind map in a minute, but just for reference, permeability, there it is, are kind of like cells in the body. Okay, so this, my mind map is a metaphor. Right now, I'm using it as a metaphor for you and your permeability to soak people in, energies in, anything in, both the good and the bad. Now, if you are permeable and you let in a lot of stuff, a few things could happen. Number one, if you let in the wrong people, the wrong energies, the wrong food, the wrong toxins, anything of that matter, it could poison you, right? So you don't want to do that. On the other hand, if you're permeable to good stuff, then you could let in the light and create what I love the most of all, which is synergy. A one plus one is greater than two phenomenon, which exists in panel number 7. And by the way, if you don't know the mind map, don't worry about it. I'm going to go over it. So this is all going to make sense to you in a little bit. But in the meantime, I want you to think about this panel 7. 1 plus 1 is greater than 2. How do you get synergy? You have to be somewhat permeable because if you're not, then you're not going to expose your light. You're not going to expose other people's light. And you're definitely not going to expose any light to the world. So permeable is important. Now, why can it be your superpower? Because even if you're permeable, let's say to the wrong people, it can be of value to you because it's sort of like tasting food. Okay? How do you know you like it? How do you know it's good for you? Well, hopefully you don't eat a whole plate of it and then get sick and throw up. Maybe you taste a little bit of it and see how it agrees with your stomach, how it agrees with your system. Same thing with quote tasting people, okay? And I don't mean that in a carnivorous way or cannibalistic way, although I guess it can be that too in some cultures. What I mean by it is that we want to know if somebody is good for us. One of the things that inspired this show is that I saw a YouTube video and somebody, and I wish I can give him credit, said, how do you know somebody's good for you? And one surefire way to tell is how that person affects your nervous system. So if you allow yourself to be permeable to the person and then you get sick and your muscles get tight and your stomach gets upset and you walk away feeling less than, then you know that you allowed something in, someone in that's not good for you. But you couldn't have known that unless you were permeable. Now, the trick to all of this and the superpower part of it is that we need to experience things in order to know if it's going to work or not, or if it's going to be a plus one or a minus one. So, permeability as a superpower means simply let a little bit of it in, taste it, see how the energy is, see how the um, configuration between you and another person, as an example, work together. Is it synergistic? Is it like a vampire effect and you feel drained and used? Is it sort of like a recipe for a disaster where you're going to be defrauded eventually because they're setting you up uh, to be taken advantage of? But you don't know until you sample the goods, okay? So let's talk a little bit about the mind map and how permeability affects people and why some people are what I call permeable, some people are non-permeable, and what I call semi-permeable, which is a good place to be because it's a question of letting in the good and keeping out the bad, meaning being selective. So let's go through the mind map and then we'll get to permeability as we go down the yellow brick road of the mind map. So if you look at panel number 1, you will see the light and the darkness. So again, my mind map is very metaphorical in that it points to the two aspects of us. We've got our light, which is the best of our best, and then we have our darkness, which oftentimes are the bruises of childhood wounds, bruises like neglect, bruises like verbal abuse, physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional, physical neglect, narcissistic parents, being controlling or being controlled by parents. So those are the wounds that shadow us. And then there are lots more. There's obviously wounds that physically affect us through accidents and poor health and life circumstances. So, in other words, life beats us up, and then our challenge is to overcome our obstacles and let in the light. So that's panel 1. So what does that have to do with permeability? You'll see as we go down the yellow brick road of the mind map. So if we're too bruised, then we crack up. So look at panel number 2, and you could see the metaphor of the broken glass. So panel 2 represents our reactions to the wound. And these reactions are primarily in our amygdala, which is our primitive brain, our fight, flight, freeze, and fawn system. So when we are vulnerable, which we are as babies, we don't know how to self-regulate. And so if we don't have parents that soothe us and give us the scheduling and the comfort and the eye to eye and skin to skin, and ideally breastfeeding, and ideally parents who really know how to emotionally nourish us. If we don't get that, then we become quickly dysregulated as infants. And if this continues to go on, we literally crack up. So that's panel 2, is that we get broken if we are not parented well, and or if the world is just too harsh on us, then we cannot withstand it. So then we go into the fight mode, which we can't as infants. We can go into the flight mode, which we can't because we can't flee, we can't fight back. We can fawn and we can freeze. So I guess fawning and freezing and shutting down are the options. And so what happens through the course of life is that all of our childhood wounds and also the good stuff gets encoded. So if you look at panel number 3, this is the first level encoding that we experience. And these encodes, as I like to call them, come from childhood wounds and how we reacted and how we were soothed or not. And then they encode in us, panel 3, if you could put that one up. And this is the result of part 1 system gone wrong. Do you have a picture of panel 3 there? Are you there? Is the screen frozen? Okay, I have no idea what's happening, but panel 3 looks like this. I'll just hold it up to, oh, there it is. Thank you so much. So panel 3 is like a DNA strand encoded. And so if we look at it as a family system, we can relate to one strand of the DNA is coming from your father, the other one is coming from your mother, or whoever are your primary caregivers, and they're supposed to create a structure upon which we climb. Are we okay on the tech side of things? Hello? Hopefully
Sorry, I
we are.
didn't realize I pushed the wrong button. Yes, I'm here.
Okay, so if you could look at panel number 3, you could see that it's that's panel 4. That comes after panel 3. So look at panel 3 and you could see all of the toxicity in the background. And if you look carefully, you can see little people hanging around and sitting around and climbing around, and they're not quite evolving because the system doesn't support them to be the best of their best. And that's why this is a metaphor for more darkness and kind of a devolution, the beginning of a devolution, if you will, and encoding things that become core beliefs within us. Core beliefs like we're not good enough, we're not smart enough, we're not powerful enough, and those kinds of core beliefs that actually get triggered by life and then end us in panel number 4, chaos. Okay, so when we're in chaos, there is no compass, no north, south, east, or west. The people are just flying off in outer space. There's a lot of toxicity. There's no structure. It's kind of like anarchy, chaos. Okay, a lot of what we're seeing in the world today, unfortunately. So what happens when we're in chaos is we get more dysregulated, we don't know what to do, and so we end up defending ourselves. And now we're in panel 5, which is why I wanted to go through this so that you can understand permeability, semi-permeability, and non-permeability. So what is panel 5? Again, a metaphor for permeable cells, non-permeable cells, semi-permeable cells. So let me ask you guys a question. What happens to a cell if it's too permeable? Anybody want to put that in the chat room? I'm kind of pop quizzing you today. What would you say if you're too permeable, if you just let anybody and everyone in, if you just soak in all of it, what happens? Anybody want to put an answer in the chat room there?
Someone says would lose its ability to maintain its internal something. I can't read it, but
that's right. It would lose its ability to maintain its internal boundaries, structure.
Oh, there you go.
That's exactly correct. Okay, so that's not good, but I did say that it is a superpower. So sometimes you've got to open up in order to taste that energy field and see if it's right for you. Now, what happens if you're totally non-permeable? So we talked about permeability. It's too loose, okay? It can just let in too much of the bad. What about the non-permeable? What if you don't let anybody in? What if you're a hermit and you don't trust people and you're a bit on the paranoid side and you decide that the human race is not worth really engaging with and you isolate yourself? Then what happens? Anybody want to put an answer in the chat room? If you close the doors, if you're non-permeable, then what? So, anyone want to guess at that one?
So far, nobody's done, but they also could call in at 323-524-259 to let Dr. Judy know via phone. But yes, so far, nobody's wants to take a stab at that one.
Okay, well, the first one was correct, okay? And this is kind of behind the scenes anonymous, and who cares if you get it right or wrong, because we're, on a journey here together. But as you can intuitively tell, if you're non-permeable, you put too thick a wall between you and other people, and there's no light, okay? So you're in the darkness, and you're kind of steeped in your own squat, and there's also no growth. Both non-permeable and permeable membranes do not allow for synergy, because if you're too permeable, you can be overtaken by the wrong person, which is not synergistic. And if you're non-permeable, you don't let anybody play a better game of life with you and let them in so that they can deposit something good into your life, because a lot of people have been too permeable, and so therefore they react by becoming non-permeable. So the way that we function best is by becoming, usually we want to be semi-permeable, meaning we want to be open to people, but not too open to people and definitely not too close to people, because it's only through being semi-permeable that we create synergy and make new friends and allow ourselves the pleasure of letting in new ideas, new feelings, new experiences, and that's where we want to be in life. We don't want to close ourselves off from the light. So when we are not able to be semi-permeable, then what ends up happening is we either break down, okay? So what happens if we're in a psychological prison of non-permeability? We end up imploding. Okay, so let's look at panel number 6 for a minute. So yeah, there it is, panel number 6. So you don't let anybody in. There's no oxygen getting into your system of life. And so as a consequence of that, you implode within yourself. So that is where you start breaking down. Implosion is an example of that, might be aggression turned inward. So when you're angry, when you're unexpressed, when you don't have anybody to let steam off with, then you end up imploding. So that's not good. And the opposite is exploding. So if you let too much in and you get too permeated by the wrong people, then you might end up exploding. So what the therapeutic antidote to that would be is, instead of imploding or exploding, you want to be unloading therapeutically, or with a great friend, or a spouse, or somebody that you trust, so that you don't build it up or you don't project your anger on other people. You know, like the kick the dog phenomenon. You come home from work, you're angry, you have nowhere to put that energy, and so you project it all over your significant other, your dog, or anybody else. So you don't want that kind of breakdown to happen. So let's go back to the superpower part of it. Some people think that, oh, I'm too sensitive, oh, I'm too um, much of a sucker. Well, that may be the case if you're too permeable, but you've got to let some of it in order to know. You can't know unless you open the door at least a little bit. And that's why it's a superpower. So let me talk about being a psychologist and why my permeability is a superpower. Because in therapy, people will project all kinds of feelings upon me, and my job is to, so to speak, taste those feelings, or in other words, experience those feelings, so that I get a sense of that person's inner world. So for me, permeability means information, very valuable psychological information about their state of being, their pain, their level of ability to withstand and tolerate pain. I think we have a question.
We
Go
do,
ahead.
we do. And I think this is a great question. It says, how does permeability show up in people like with anxiety, PTSD, and codependency? And then they have a part 2, and how can it be transformed into empowerment rather than enmeshment?
Okay, that's a great question. Let's go one at a time. Okay, so how can this permeability affect people with anxiety?
Yeah, anxiety, PTSD, and codependency.
Okay, so with anxiety, that simply means that, let's go back to the cause. Perhaps you got dysregulated early on in childhood because you had some sort of um, an anxious attachment with a parent where they didn't regulate you, meaning soothe you. And so you didn't have the developmental privilege, so to speak, of having somebody coat your feelings and make a kind of a semi-permeable wall for you to exist within. And now you don't have that. You don't have that protection. And so anything comes in, And when anything comes in, you go to panel 2, which is the amygdala, which is the dysregulation, and then you become too permeable and you don't have the ability to settle down, to self-soothe. So then you're more likely to fall into anxiety because you're permeated. Okay, now the second one was PTSD, yes?
Yes, correct.
Okay, so with PTSD, that implies that something really traumatic happened to you. So complex PTSD is a childhood wounding of PTSD where it is chronic and it is developmentally steeped in your years of progression through life. So it might be that you've been neglected too long or name called too much or physically abused or sexually abused or controlled or you have unempathic parents. So in that case, it's very, very difficult again to develop those boundaries, right? So with PTSD, it's a little different than complex PTSD because in PTSD, something happens, something traumatic. You get hit by a car, God forbid, or something traumatic happens in your life, and now you have flashbacks. And so the veil of protection has literally been penetrated way too far. Do you see that? So that membrane that's supposed to protect you is now um, popped. So it's no longer a protective wall, and you don't have the ability to um, feel that you're safe behind that protective shield. And so when you're not safe, then you feel vulnerable to all the elements of the world and you get flashbacks and you're triggered by sounds or voices, or you might have nightmares or symptoms of extreme anxiety and so on. And so that's just an extreme part of it. And what was part 3 of that?
Codependency.
Codependency. Okay, so let's say that you're using codependency as a defense mechanism to regulate you. So now what you're doing is you're pulling another person in, and instead of creating light, which is when you have interdependency, where both of you benefit from each other, codependency is when, let's say, one person is very weak and they latch on to another person for that strength and they never really develop their own strength, and the other person is sort of pulled down with it, or maybe gets their jollies out of being in power and control over the codependent one, as is in the case of narcissistic abuse. That doesn't carry any light with it either. So codependency is where you are so weak and permeated that you need somebody to bolster you and be a sort of a supply of emotional grounding for you. Okay? Does that make sense, I hope, to the person who asked the question?
You can let us know in the chat room if that makes sense.
Yeah, let me know.
And
Okay, so hopefully I'm making the distinction between the three. And then what was the other part of the question,
how
please?
can it be transformed into empowerment rather than enmeshment?
Okay, so whenever we're dysfunctioning in life, we have to step back and we have to take responsibility of the fact that there's a system operating that's gone wrong. And the only way I know how to empower ourselves through a system gone wrong is let's go back to being vulnerable and permeable. So now we've got to be vulnerable and permeable to ourselves and say, I'm not feeling well. I'm not really doing that well. What's going on here? Why am I in a codependent relationship? Why am I shutting down? Why am I letting a bunch of horrible people through the gate and letting them infiltrate into my life? This is not good. So this is where you have to go back to your childhood wounds and see who messed with your membrane and created it to be too hard or too soft or maybe just right. And then as you go through your childhood wounds and you are able to identify them, then through the process of therapy, you can start identifying them as opposed to identifying with them. And that's what the mind map therapy is all about, is to separate you being embroiled in reactionary mode or shutdown mode or whatever mode, and understand that you are at the effect of part one of your life, meaning that you didn't plan on it, but now you've got to self correct, meaning number one, self reflect, then self correct, and then be the cause of a different outcome. And only through consciousness and being conscious can you create a new blueprint. So that means that you have to go through panels 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and tear down the old system and then rebuild something new, as you can see in panel number 7, 8, 9. So that's why the mind map is an encode, decode, and recode process. And now we're down on the bottom here of recoding. And so recoding means that we are recalibrating. So in panel number 7, we're recalibrating our permeability. So you could see that the bubbles are coming together and they're syncing up, and they're creating something that's only possible through being at least semi-permeable, okay, and letting other people in, the right people, not the codependent one, not the narcissistic one, not the avoidant one, because that's not going to create any light. So the best way to achieve panel 7 is 2 healthy people coming together to make a better we. So it's one healthy person and another healthy person, both of who worked on themselves, and then creating something of the light. Yes, another question. Go ahead.
Yes, this person says, I struggle with boundaries. How can they learn to remain open without absorbing everyone else's emotions or energies when it comes to
I
permeable
wish you would
struggles?
call. Thank you for the question. I wish you would call in so we could see what your injury was. So if you're struggling with boundaries, then somebody either penetrated your boundaries by being too intrusive, verbally, physically, sexually, in some way. And as children, remember, we're vulnerable. We need our parents to protect us. We need somebody to protect us. So we've got to recalibrate those boundaries by understanding who done it, what happened, why the walls are not fortifying us, and what exactly that injury is. And then we have to therapeutically work through the anger, the violation, the sadness, the grief that comes with it. And that's the therapy that I'm talking about. You can't just be resetting your boundaries without understanding who done it and who hurt you and why you're violating. So, but if you're struggling with boundaries, that can be used as a superpower, and I'll tell you how, is simply by knowing that something's off here. So now you've tasted, so to speak, you've let somebody in maybe that you shouldn't have let in. And so now you can see something's off here. And so either it's off with the person that you let in, that's likely, and maybe the person you let in is in because there's something off with you. In other words, you don't know how to properly discriminate the good from the bad. And so that's what you have to look at. And that's why you have to go back to the violators in your life. And they're usually, unfortunately, mommy dearest and daddy dearest are primary caregiver related. And even if they couldn't help it, like there was something going on in their lives where they couldn't be the best parent in the world, nature doesn't care. Why? The point is that you're left feeling vulnerable. So if you don't heal up that vulnerability, you're going to continue to let people through the gates and then infiltrate you and overflood you, overwhelm you, and eventually poison you. Okay? So um, you can use it as a superpower by knowing that something's wrong and then going on a journey to fix that something wrong. Because, look, if you're living in a home and you've got a gate around you or a fence around you or whatever, or a brick wall, and the enemy's coming through, then you didn't do a very good job fortifying your environment. On the other hand, um, if you just have no gates and no nothing, then maybe you're too subject to just anybody passing through. So you, I want you to use it more as a metaphor than an actual gate or wall or some object that I'm describing, and to understand that we all need discernment. So this is all about being psychologically able to discern who should be in and should be out, and who you should park in a kind of a neutral zone until you know better. So if you meet a new person, you don't just lend them money and let them live free rent in your house and treat them for everything that they desire. That would be a horrible situation. What you do is you get to know them, you talk to them, you see if they're trustworthy, you see who their friends are. You know, the old adage, birds of a feather flock together. So you want to see if they're responsible, if they keep their word, if they're contributing something to your life. And those are the people, at least in my case, that I'm interested in getting to know and nurture and foster for friendship, because it is rare to meet somebody that you feel synergy with. And when you do, you've got to put in the effort and the your own light, and see what comes of it, because that's where miracles are, is the panel number 7, if you will. Go back to that. The miracle is in trusting that there are people out there that you can let in, and they're not going to vampire you. They're not going to rob you, right? They're not going to drag you down. They're not going to make you sick. They're not going to sap you of your energy, make you sick, basically. Um, and maybe there's creativity between you and that other person. Maybe there is support. Maybe there is fun. Maybe there is health. There's discovery. There's all kinds of things that happen in the, it's kind of like a Venn diagram, I think, for math, right? The overlapping circles. There's something magical that comes about when two people bring their energies together. It's like a third entity, if you will. And that's what we are meant to do, is to interconnect with people so that we can bring more of ourselves through the interaction with somebody who's also striving to be of the light. So if your permeable membrane is not functioning really well, then you can see that panel 7, instead of creating light, is going to vampire you, or one is going to suck the other dry or overshadow the other. And those are not great relationships. So I hope that answers your question.
It
Maybe.
did, and somebody did follow up and says, can these emotional permeability actually enhance relationships rather than
Yes,
damage them?
yeah, yes, yes, yes. But if you're emotionally permeable to a narcissist, no, no, no. Because what you're going to find
Right.
is you're going to be sucked dry, okay? Or if you yourself are codependent, you're going to suck the energy, drive somebody else.
Hmm.
Or if you just don't have the ability um, to to really gatekeep your boundaries, then you might attract anybody and anything, and then taint your other relationships with people who are poisonous in general. You know, haven't you ever had that happen? you're in a nice friendship circle and then you meet somebody and that friend sort of poisons the apple cart, so to speak. So you don't want to bring that into an environment where you're doing well and your friends are doing well, or you're in a family and your family's doing well. You don't want to bring toxicity into a nice situation. That's why I'm talking about it. It's so important. Discernment, boundary discernment, and permeability as a superpower, not to open up to anybody and everybody, but just to be able to say, okay, I'm going to let my gut, okay, my instincts taste what it's like being around the person. And I was just having a discussion with a new friend today, and we were talking about how people affect us and infect us and infiltrate us. And we don't have the time or energy to tolerate that because, there are only so much hours in a day and only so much energy we can give people. And we certainly don't want to commingle our energy with somebody that's not going to nourish us. So that's why it's so important to have those boundaries. Any other questions in the chat room?
And I think somebody wants to, they said they can't really afford therapy. Or do you have any, some therapeutic practices that they could do at home?
Totally. Look, you could get the Be the Cause Healing Human Disconnect PDF for free. It's my system. You can order it off of Amazon if you want a soft paperback copy of it, which is always nice because you can make notes. You can buy the Healing from Narcissistic Abuse video. That's online, and you can also buy at a huge discount my first video that I created called the 9-panel mind map system. So maybe you could put them both up. One is more generic. The first video I produced was back in, it must have been about 13 years ago. And my grandson is in that video because he breaks down the mind map from the point of view of a child. I think he's up there on some Facebook posts right now as we speak. And the other one is specific toward healing from narcissistic abuse. So if you could show the cover of that video, that'd be great.
What's the name of that one? Is that the Healing?
Healing from Narcissistic
There we
Abuse.
go.
That one. Yeah, you could purchase that one and stop paying a bunch of money for therapy. And then if you need a little assistance, you can call the Psychological Healing Center and I can get you somebody to help you through areas that you are struggling with. Okay, and the other one is the 9-panel mind map system to healing, which I created about 13 years ago. I don't know if you have the cover of that one. They both come with journals, and it's a do-it-yourself, and it's so inexpensive compared to therapy. And then again, you can regulate the amount of therapy that you want to pay for by letting us know what your budget is, for one, and then minimizing therapy by only consulting with a therapist on an as-needed basis. Or if you want, you can do the whole process with me or somebody on the staff. And that's obviously the most effective way because we can really break it down and get into the childhood wounds and get into all of the panels in detail, the details of your life. So that would be, sort of like the Rolls-Royce version of healing. And then the other would be just pay as you go as you need. And then the other free one is the PDF of the book. And then the other one, very inexpensive, would be the Amazon paperback and the old video, the 9-panel mind map journey to healing.
Well, so, can I ask you this, Dr. Judy?
Pardon me?
I know we haven't talked about this in a while, but the new mind map, your future, how does that entwine with what you're talking about today?
Thank you. Yeah, we haven't talked about it because remember, Mind Map Your Future is for people who've done all the work. Their boundaries are good. Their negative core beliefs have been more or less healed over. And then this is kind of like once you're healed from your childhood wounds, now you can mind map your future.
Hmm.
Okay. So now you're not tripping all over yourself. And now you can get into creating a better pathway for future because you have the psychological tools that you've learned in panels 1 through 9 in part 1. So I always tell people don't do mind map your future until you've done healing from childhood wounds. Because then what's going to happen is every time you try to mind map your future, you're going to trip up on your childhood wounds, your boundaries are going to crumble, and you're not going to get very far if you're not living in a more or less healed state. And I say more or less because we're always going to be healing for the rest of our lives. So there's no such thing as perfect healing, but you can go a long way. So I say if you really want to rock and roll ahead into the future, um, as they say, you can't go into your future until you've healed your past. And there's always going to be that shadow that follows you if you're unhealed and sabotages your future. So, yes, they go hand in hand, but we've got to do them in the right order. For those of you who have done the mind map work and you feel like you have a pretty good handle on childhood wounds and your reactions and core beliefs and your defense mechanisms, and you've let out a lot of the poison from the injuries of the past, and you feel like you're in pretty good shape for it, call me and we will start the mind map your future work. So it's sort of like, you can't go to college until you've graduated from high school. And so the high school would be doing the work, okay? And then the college would be, let's fly to the next level. That's how I see it. And too often people think that they could bypass level 1 and they can't. You can't go into a course and think that you're going to manifest your future if you're always being triggered by your past. And that's not fair to you because now you're thinking you're not doing it right. And you're not doing it right because you've got a saboteur trying to steal your light and break you down and bring you into chaos, defenses, and ultimately really shake you down into a bigger breakdown. So you don't want that domino effect. You would rather go through the process of healing and then out of strength, mind map your future. Does that make sense to everybody? I hope.
Makes sense to me.
Makes sense to you? Yeah, think about it, Tony. I mean, how would you like to build a house with no foundation?
Nope.
Like you don't, right? You don't know what material to use. You haven't taken the time to really get to know the soil and elements of the climate and your style of life and so on. And there are a lot of things to think through before you build a future for yourself. That's why people plan things. Think about that. So mind map number 1 is for um, taking down the old. Okay, remember, looking to see what we encoded so that we can decode it. And actually, in the mind map process, we're doing a little bit of future because panel number 789 speaks to the future. Because by panel number 7, you have now built proper boundaries. You now have the ability to be a better version of yourself, which brings me to be the paradigm shift, the ability to be a better me so that you can combine with better other me's to form better we's. And so in panel number 789, that's sort of like leading you into the future. And the healing panel, which is panel number 8, you could see is a better encoding than panel 3. You see, it's steel, it's strong. People are climbing the ladder, they're holding hands, they're helping each other evolve. And that's the kind of relationship you want to or relationships you want to engage with, people who are going to help you up the ladder, or people you trust will be able to, either way, you help them, they help you, they reach for you, you reach for them. So it's a constant evolution as opposed to a devolution. And so it's really, really important that you start building a new code that doesn't get torn down by negative core beliefs that are based on lies. They don't get torn down by triggers, and even if they do, then you recognize them and rebuild them quickly. And that's the only way to create unity within the self, which then creates unity on the planet. And that's something that I want to talk a little bit more about. And, what's the pathway to healing? What's the pathway to unity? Some people have their isms that they rely on for pathways. And if it gets you there, great. But you want to, so to speak, get in the right car to get you where you want to go. So you want to get with the right process, the right therapist, the right environment, the right people surrounding you. These things are very, very important because everything around us influences us. And if we're not around the right influence, if we're not, especially if we're too permeable, we could be subject to being torn down by outer forces. And we definitely don't want to do that. So any other questions in the chat room?
No questions, just more just talking amongst themselves. But yeah, no, I think this was a good show on, so you don't have to always look at it as a negative.
Yeah, and when you're in a place where you can use your permeability to understand people and see how they feel on a gut level, that's what I call intuition. You got to let a little piece of the person in. As a psychologist, I always do, just because I want to know where they're at and what they feel like in the room. And then I can know more, both clinically and intuitively, what is going on with them. And of course, the more uncomfortable I feel in the room with them, the more I know that there is a lot of childhood wounding there, a lot of cracked lens of perception there, a lot of negative core beliefs and projections that are going on. And that's how I can, quote, taste the psychopathology in the room, and that helps me to work with it. In general, unless you're a psychologist or person that he is doing some level of healing, you don't want to constantly be around people who are going to create an atmosphere of psychopathology around you, because you want to live. You want friendships that are nourishing. You want a job that nourishes you. You want to be healthy in your mind, body, soul. So I hope this helped. I hope people now understand that permeability, to a certain extent, can be very helpful and can help your intuition in gauging who is in front of you. If you've locked yourself down into psychological prison and don't open up at all, you're not going to experience the joy of synergy with other people. And if you have a semi-permeable membrane, that's a good thing because you're letting in the good and you're keeping out the bad, and you know how to discern the difference. So unless there are other questions in the chat room, are there?
Nope, that was all they have. So I think that's...
Okay. All right. Thank you so much, everyone. See you next time.